roll around here. We just wing it.
Roll me in on the wheelchair.
Hello, everybody. Angelo DeSipio here for Wrestling with the Future. Joined as I am every week by the happy haberdasher, Dan the Man Sebastiano. They call him the smartest man in the room. If you don't believe that, just ask him. He'll tell you. And tonight we've got a newcomer with us and a trusted stalwart from days gone by. But this young whippersnapper and this old fart, they've got a lot in common. They actually wrote a book together. Joining us tonight is our dear friend, a buddy of mine from a long, long time, who once in a while remembers who I am. Cowboy Scott Casey is with us, and his co-author, the guy who kind of put this book together for him. The book is called One Last Ride, The Tales of Cowboy Scott Casey, and there is the book, and it's behind me as well, my friend. And his name is Nick Masci. He's a nice Irish guy from Yonkers. How are you, Nick?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Angelo. Thanks for having me on, Dan. Yeah, getting to know Cowboy over the last 4 or 5 years has been quite the experience. It's great to be on the show with him. And, look forward to talking all things wrestling, all things One Last Ride.
Beautiful. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's talk about this. I want to get right into this. We've talked about the book before, but I want to get into this on a deep dive level. Sure. Scott and I have, of course, this is his 7th appearance on the show. I think he remembers 1 or 2 of them. But I love you, Scott. But he's been here for a few times, and we've talked about the book, intermittently. But we never took the deep dive, have we, Dan?
No, sir.
But we're going to tonight. Dan, you're the smartest guy in the room, so you should know the answers. Don't give me that look. So you should know the answers to all this stuff. So just, if I get in trouble, Dan, I'm going to throw out a lifeline and just jump in there for me. So, Scott, let me ask you a question. You and I talked before, and you said that, you wanted to put these stories and memories down in a book before you got too old to remember them. Well, you got a treasure trove of memories, brother. And every time I think that you've exhausted the storyboard, there are more. Nick, was it a daunting task for you to keep up with Scott's stories? And how did you get involved? How did you and Cowboy Scott Casey make contact, meet each other, know each other? How did all this, walk me through that process?
Sure. So for about the last 5 or 6 years now, I've been what they call a wrestling vendor, or, wrestling convention promoter. So what that is, I grew up a wrestling fan. I've been a wrestling fan all my life. And I've always, like I'm sure everyone on this call, have specifically appreciated the old school style of wrestling. That's what I grew up on. I'm 35 years old, so my first wrestling memory is 1987. And as I've gotten older, I've gone.
Can I smack you? Can I smack?
Let me smack him first.
So as
listen
I've gotten
to him, old. He's talking old school, and he's 35.
Well,
right?
Listen, I feel like in wrestling wise, I'm wise beyond my years, because I have an appreciation of everything that came before me. And so I've worked with, hundreds of talents over the last 5 or 6 years. And Cowboy, I first worked with about 4 years ago. And we had done an appearance up in the New York, New Jersey area. We did a wrestling convention appearance, Legends of the Ring in New Jersey. My company is named Captain's Corner, by the way. And I brought Scott in for a signing. And me and Scott clicked, and we kept in touch for the next few months. A few months later, Scott actually suffered a heart attack and, had quadruple bypass surgery. And I kept in touch with him throughout the whole time. I know it was a traumatic, and rightfully so, traumatic experience in his life. And, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But Scott, persevered. And afterwards, when he was in recovery and, kind of coming to grips with it, he realized, I think we both realized that, Scott is one of those last road warriors of the ring, worked everywhere in the United States, into Japan and, Australia in the 70s and 80s. And we needed to get Scott's stories out there. I've written before short form, never anything long form, never anything published. So this was a task, I guess, a vanity project for me. as a wrestling fan, as you know, I would say someone who enjoys writing. I'm not going to say I'm a good writer, but I'm someone who enjoys writing. I think I've developed into a okay writer. But Scott has so many stories, and he was able to. I did a lot of research on Scott, but Scott remembers those stories so vividly. He may tell the same 20 stories over and over again, but the ones he remembers, he's got such great attention to detail, and we clicked, me and Scott. So it was never a chore talking to Scott, to where if Scott was closer, he's someone that I would, grab a drink or grab a burger with at the bar and just bullshit. So that's kind of what we did every time we saw each other. And then obviously we spent a lot of time talking over the phone. I would say well over 60 hours just of recording time over the phone, going through Scott's career, going through the first draft of the book, so on and so forth. So, Scott was an open book. There was pretty much nothing that was off limits. A couple of stories that we didn't share just because the stories didn't necessarily involve Scott. Scott didn't want to throw anyone under the bus, which goes to show you the kind of person he is. He was an open book life. But he didn't want to get any of the boys in trouble. Angelo, you talk enough with the boys. You know how the boys are. Who's married, married. So Scott was very fair with that. And we had a great time. The process took over 10 months, a little under a year, and we released it the first quarter of 2019. And we've done autograph signings in Texas and Florida and the Carolinas and New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. Couple of different towns in New York. I would say about 5 or 6, Texas, about 6 or 7.
Nick, you're Legends of the Ring. That was in Somerset, New Jersey, right?
Monroe, New Jersey, not too far.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right outside of Somerset. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sir.
I remember that. There have been several in that area over the years. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, that was the home base for quite a little while.
That was the first big wrestling convention that ran regularly in the area. At this point, they just moved from Monroe to I forgot. I think they were going to Woodbridge now, but they were in Monroe, this hotel for over 15 years.
Yeah, and there were problems with the hotel accommodations.
Yeah, as someone who went there as a fan when I was a teenager, or at least my early 20s. And then now has been working with them for the last 5 or 6 years, 7 years. The hotel kind of became more and more outdated. They weren't putting the money in.
Yeah.
And by the last show they had there, which was at this point, October of 2019, because both of their shows were canceled for this year, obviously with everything going on.
Yeah.
But the accommodation just weren't there. What you want for like a top-notch hotel for all the talent and the fans that are flying. So.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'll tell you what, I've actually had to cancel a couple of appearances as well. Scott, talk to me about this young squire named Nick Masci. How did he present himself to you when you met this kid? Was he a snot-nosed little punk, or was he a respectable young man?
Respectable young man, really. I mean, I love Nick to death, and if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be with the book. I mean, he did such a great job on it. It was, and the cover is unbelievable. And he, like I told him, I said, I could have probably had 25 guys in divorce court, but I didn't talk about anything like that because, I mean, it's none of their damn business. So anyway,
it's funny that you say that, Scott, because I've had. And Dan will tell you, I've had, in the last month, I've had 5 wrestling book authors on the show. In fact, we have another show Thursday with yet another author. Kenny Casanova will be here. And they don't mind throwing people under the bus, I got to tell you. The fact that...
what goes around comes around. And if it's coming back at me, I want it to be nice. It's just common courtesy and the way you're brought up. I mean, sure, you might sell a few more books, but it's not worth it in the long run, really. That's the way I look at it.
You're absolutely right, Dan.
Yes, sir.
I'm sure you've got questions for these fine gentlemen. Have at it.
I do actually. Nick kind of struck a chord with his opening statement where he talked about being a fan of the old school days, despite 35. I'm 37, and I grew up watching. I enjoyed more watching the old territory tapes than I did watching some of what was on TV at the time.
Absolutely.
And I guess I'm curious from that end. And this is more for you, Nick, than Scott. But how did you go about, like, explain kind of that story? How did that go about from tuning in as a kid? Like, you mentioned 1987, so you had Saturday night and Worldwide was Saturday mornings. How did you go about from that to let me watch? Because this is New York, New Jersey, or excuse me, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia. You didn't have NWA Southwest Regional. How did you go about discovering people like Scott Casey and Jerry Lawler and some of these Southern names? How did you go about doing that as a fan growing up in the 80s?
So my connection was actually when my family got cable in the Bronx. It was, I think, 1989. So I watched, of course, WWF, and I'd watched the syndicated NWA shows, worldwide, like you said. But when I got ESPN, that was when I started watching Heroes of World Class and AWA. And that stuff, actually, that was when I first saw Kerry Von Erich for the first time and Jerry Lawler for the first time. And, the Destruction Crew I was a big fan of. And, Iceman Parsons and all of these guys that, you didn't see at the time in the NWA. You didn't see for Vince. So it was a whole new world of wrestling. And as a kid, I didn't know Eric Embry was another guy I loved. And I couldn't put my finger on it, but it just felt different than what I was watching on Superstars or what I was watching on, a Worldwide or one of the syndicated shows in Channel 11.
Right.
It just different, that Texas style of wrestling, or even the AWA.
I got you. Let me follow up on that, Scott. Mm-hmm. How does it feel?
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking before we started recording, about age and getting older and all that. How does it feel being, at where you are now and having fans that, were grew up watching you on tape that are still fans? Like you talked about doing book signings and promotions. I mean, I've been to these wrestling conventions. Half the crowd there is under the age of 35, and yet you and we talked about it on other shows with like Wahoo McDaniel and some of these names where they get more attention than the modern talent. How does that feel, having so many fans that grew up watching you after the fact and are still loving your work?
I'm obviously very grateful. I mean, we busted our ass to get the people to come back. I'll give you a prime example of that. I'm wrestling Dory Funk Jr. for the title, the World Heavyweight Belt, in Amarillo. And we did a 2 out of 3 fall match. And this was brought back to me by a fan it texted me one day and asked me about it. I literally, not casually, but literally, broke and tore my little finger. It was hanging after the first fall. He had won the first fall. I go back to the dressing room, and I'm taping it up, and I'm hollering and carrying on because, Angela, honest to God, I almost passed out. It hurt so bad. So anyway, Wahoo says, "Kid, did anybody tell you had to do this for a living?" "No, oh shit." He said, "Well, shut the fuck up." You can find sympathy alphabetically in the dictionary between shit and syphilis. And Nick has heard me say that many, many times. And it's true. And it'll work in life. Yeah, I mean, it's just the way it is, And
that's funny.
Just, but this guy asked me, he said, "How did you go back out there and do that with your finger hanging like that?" "Well, I taped it up." I said, "I tell you what, kid, I was afraid that Wahoo was going to beat the shit out of me if I didn't get out there and finish the 2 out of 3 fall."
Exactly.
He started,
and not only that, and sell it too.
Oh, I didn't mind selling it at all. I was hurting like a son of a. I mean, it went up my arm, down my side, but that was, back then they didn't carry doctors with them like they do now. I mean, they have doctors and chiropractors and stuff. And,
Karen McDaniel's a good friend of the show, Scott. Wahoo's wife, Karen. She's a good friend of mine, good friend of the show. We had her here. She's been here a few times, as a matter of fact. And she said the funny thing about Wahoo, that if you didn't sell and he knew you weren't selling, he'd beat the shit out of you on a shoot to get you to sell for him.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, you're looking at a guy that was about 5'11", 290.
Right.
He played middle linebacker for the New York Jets and for the Dallas Texans before 1960 they became the Cowboys. But anyway, I mean, this guy, he didn't ask for any quarters and he didn't take any. I mean, he would literally. I saw him one night with Johnny Valentine. We were up in Norfolk, Virginia, and they literally beat the piss out of each other. And like Johnny said, you may not believe it's real. He said, but you'll believe what we do is real. And
we heard that story firsthand. Dan and I heard that story firsthand from Karen.
Yeah.
Firsthand.
Yeah.
Yep, we sure did.
You know, I guess maybe my mind's gone blank, but I really, when I left San Antonio in the 80s, I had never met Karen. So I you know, I mean, maybe I did, and I can't, you know, I'm getting that sometimer's disease. I don't know, but I don't, I mean, she seemed like a real nice person, and it was fun being around her for the little time that I was, but you know,
right.
Anywho,
so where did while I got you there, Scott, let me ask you this, Scott. I'll throw this at you. Maybe you or Nick, whoever wants to jump in on it. Where did the working title of One Last Ride come from? Whose idea was that?
It was Nick's. I mean, he brought this out.
So I have a funny story about that. If you guys want, I've never told this story public, so you'll appreciate this. So
okay, go ahead.
The initial title of the book that Scott and I agreed on was "Time is a Diminishing Asset: The Tale of Cowboy Scott Casey." Right, Scott? Remember?
Yes, absolutely. A friend of mine in St. Pete, Florida, Lee Dutcher, said that to me one day. And then he also said, it's not what you make, it's what you save. I mean, this guy was...
Exactly.
He still is. Unbelievable. You know, I mean, I'll have him get with me sometime and we'll get on there because a great guy. But anyway, he wasn't a wrestler. It never has. A very smart fellow and all that. But anyway, he came up with some of this stuff. And when he told me that time is a diminishing asset, I had to sit there and think about it for a while. And then I thought, oh, shit, 40 or 50 years have gone by, you know, since you started. You know, I started in 70. And, you know, it's 2020, you know. Where does it go?
So I'm going to jump back in to finish that story, Scott. So we love the title, Time is a Diminishing Asset. And I was talking to Dutch Mantel. I brought in Dutch Mantel for a convention one time. And Dutch Mantel was like, oh, how's Scott Casey doing? I'm like, well, I'm writing his book. We've been working together on this book for the last 8 months. It's going to be coming out soon, blah, 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 blah. He's like, oh, great. So he's like, what's the name of the book? So I said, Time is a Diminishing Asset, The Tale of Cowboy Scott Casey. And he's like, time is a diminishing asset? He's like, Nick, don't take this the wrong way, but wrestling fans don't give a fuck about assets, diminishing assets.
Exactly.
He's like, you need to have a catchier, shorter title. So I always had the idea of One Last Ride in my mind, you know, just from Cowboy Scott Casey, and you know, obviously, Last Ride being so closely associated with the Cowboy, and Scott's going through this life-changing experience in the later years of his life with, you know, the health recovery from his quadruple bypass surgery. And then I'm like, you know what? You're right, Dutch. So I told him a couple of weeks later, I'm like, hey, Dutch, we're going with One Last Ride. He's like, good. That last title sucked.
Exactly.
Like, I gotta tell you something with Dutch. We were drunk one night and talking about marriages, and I told him, I said, I've been married 7 times. And, well, I haven't, but anyway, he put that in his book, and I said, what the hell? If it sells books, I'm for it. I've been married 20 times. Who cares, you know? But that was Dutch. Anywho.
Well, I tell you what, he's a character.
Yeah,
he's a character. Yeah. Well, let's talk about. Well, let's go into the deep dive, the inner workings of this book. Sure. You know, anybody who's written a book, and by the way, I've written a book, so I understand what it's like. It's a lot of work, first of all.
Absolutely.
If you don't have somebody to work with you, it's a lot of work. It's frustrating and it's aggravating. But it
would have been like me. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if it had been just me, it would have been me, Larry, Curly, and Mo. I mean, come on. I don't know anything about riding.
Well, that's pretty much who worked on my book with me. Me, Mo, Larry, and Curly. But no, and I can tell you that it's frustrating on many levels, especially if it's your story, because you want it to be right. You want to leave, of course, you want to leave your most embarrassing stuff out. You want to keep your, you want to make yourself look, on your best game, so to speak, right? But sometimes in a tell-all, but sometimes, in a tell-all book, it's not always prudent to do that, because then it becomes self-righteous or self-aggrandizing to make yourself look too good, almost too perfect. Nick, how did you walk that balance between humanity and wrestling star with Scott? Because there are, there are two different personalities here.
Absolutely. So I think I never met Scott when he was selling out arenas in San Antonio in the late 70s, early 80s. I didn't know Scott when he was working for the Von Erichs and they were all over ESPN. And, I didn't know Scott when he worked for Vince. But the Scott I know is an extremely, he'll say it's because of age, but he's an extremely humble person. You would never know that, he sold out arenas in upwards of 12, 13,000 people at some point in his life, which is something that how many people can really say? Not many is the correct answer, but you would never know that speaking to this version of Scott that I knew. So getting the truth from Scott was always pretty easy. And Scott was also very open and very honest about, mistakes he's made and where some shortcomings were and, areas he did really well in, areas he didn't really do as much in, So that part was actually dealing with Scott didn't have much of an ego when it came to getting the truth out of him. It was just finding ways to kind of spark Scott's memory and getting stories and getting the book out of him. That's what I did. I was the facilitator. Yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
Continuing on that narrative with the stories, where did you go? I mean, obviously you talked about the overcoming the bypass and everything. Where did you decide to focus? Because when you have a career that spanned nearly 30 years and you have 10 lifetimes worth of stories that you could write, you could fill a bookshelf with Scott Casey stories. Like, how did you fine tune that into one book? What narrative? Like, how did you choose the narrative you ended up going with?
So I like go ahead, Scott.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I like to think of One Last Ride is almost someone's in a 4 or 5 hour car ride with Scott, and they've each got a case of beer, and they're going from town A to town B, because those are the books that I get the most enjoyment out of. I like reading those books. Me and Scott agreed early we were not going to talk a lot about his personal life. We were going to stick on, obviously there's an origin story there. We talk about Scott being born, a little bit about, the development process as a human being, but we realized wrestling fans want to hear wrestling stories. They don't really care that Scott was married to this person or he was married to this person or, his third cousin on his mom's side, was born in this town in Texas. So we kept it to stories about Scott's career, and then we kind of just kept the timeline about Scott breaking into the business, with Bobby Duncombe, and then, working for the Funks, and then going to Florida, and then so on and so forth. So we kept it, and Scott spent 6 years of his life in San Antonio. So a big portion of the book is, I think about probably close to 20% of the book is his time in San Antonio. His time working for Joe Blanchard, his time working with Tully Blanchard, with Gino Hernandez, Len Denton, all the guys in that Southwest Championship Wrestling, Wahoo McDaniel, Tom Jones, Mil Mascaris, all those guys. And we spend a lot of time talking about the Von Erichs, because, of course, he spent a lot of time with the Von Erichs, spent a lot of time working for Fritz. And then, Vince also, a lot of people that maybe were not as familiar with Scott's time in the Texas area they know Scott from his time working for Vince McMahon nationally, hitting every state in the country. So we spent time talking about that with, all of the names that, Joe Schmo on the street would know. Your Andre the Giant, your Hulk Hogan. And Scott spent time with all of those guys. He's got great stories about all those guys.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, by the time I met Scott in 1985, it was 85, 86, but it was clearly at the Philadelphia Spectrum backstage, because I lived backstage at the Spectrum. I had already known who he was. Scott, I already knew who Cowboy Scott Casey was, and I probably at that point, I'm guessing you probably had close to 16 or 17 years in the business already by that point.
Yes, I did.
Is that about right? So about 16, 17 years?
Right. It was about 17, almost 18. Anyway.
Right. And
when I first, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and when you and I met, because one of the things that I did at the Spectrum was to, make everybody comfortable. That was my job, backstage hospitality. The fact that, I connected with the wrestling folks more than any other group of people should say an awful lot about me. Maybe not some positive. I don't know. Shut up, Daniel. But the fact that, that I had this camaraderie with wrestling folks speaks volumes. Of them and me. But Scott Casey and I kind of hit it off.
Yes, we did.
And it's funny, because one of the things that you're going to laugh, what the things that bring people together, and it wasn't wrestling stuff. It was the most mundane, ridiculous conversation about food. Food. The difference between northern food and the stuff you get in Texas. And the stuff you get in Texas. But that's that's how this Cowboy Scott Casey and I met. We got acquainted over food, talking about food. And I know that he likes Italian. He must like Italian an awful lot. He got an Italian kid to write a book for him.
I know. What is it with all you guys got if you don't have an I in your name, you're not an Italian, I guess. I don't know.
I don't know, brother.
Anyway, Nick and I were, I think, correct me, Nick, in Jersey when we went to that Mexican restaurant?
Yep, sir. That was Legends of the Ring. Yep.
Oh, my God. I've eaten a lot of Mexican food, and all you Texans that are listening, I'm sorry, but this was the best fajita I had ever had in my life. God almighty, it was good. And you should take Nick to it. Take Angelo to it, and he'll appreciate it after you do. Honest to God, it's so good.
If you're telling me that you found a better fajita in New Jersey than you did in the Tex-Mex region of America, brother, I'll give you gas money to come and get me.
Like a winner. But honest to God,
I'll pay your trans to come and get me. No, I'll tell you what though. It's funny though, the simplest conversations bring people together. Mm-hmm. And it was easy to find out.
You get tired of hearing everybody, well, what's this guy like? What's that guy like? And sometimes very often you get into good conversations about food. And it was refreshing, instead of somebody trying to either get in your back pocket or get in your head about your wrestling. And I enjoyed it.
Exactly. And that is precisely where I'm going next with it. One of the things I liked that you did in the book, and I don't know if it was, maybe Nick, you can address this, you and Scott, but I don't know if this was a deliberate thing, but there was a concerted effort to concentrate almost exclusively on the stories. You presented this as perfectly as you could say it. You said it earlier.
Yep.
This book is a car ride.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is. This book is a car ride. The only other book, and I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to plug this because he's a friend of yours. The only other book that even comes close to Cowboy Scott Casey's book is a book that Jimmy Valiant wrote called Mercy Daddy. It was called Woo Mercy Daddy, the Jimmy Valiant story, and I'm in that book. So thank you, Jimmy. But that book is 600 pages.
I know.
Of car ride.
Yeah,
that's what it is. It's a 600-page book that takes you from coast to coast, from pillar to post, in every wrestling venue, small and large, across the country. And I get that same feeling from One Last Ride. It's like,
you got to.
It's like going back in a time machine too, Scott. You know, you can almost close your eyes and envision certain things taking place around you. If you read a few lines and then close your eyes a bit, you can imagine it happening. You know, the smoke-filled arena.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the small sleepy town. You know, go ahead, Nick.
No, yeah. Well, thank you for the high praise, Angelo. And I read Boogie's book. His book was fantastic. So, and I'll be working with Boogie Woogie Man in a few weeks. So I'll tell him that you said hi, Angelo. Yeah.
Yeah. Where are you going to work with him at?
Virginia. I'm going to be going down to where he's in Shawsville. So I'm going to be going down to that area.
Yeah, sure is. Yeah.
And doing we can't really do public signings, but doing a virtual signing with him. So. Yeah, so I'm excited.
Please give him my best. I spoke to him about a month ago. Please do give him my best.
Absolutely.
So, continue.
But what like you said, that was my goal, is because I've worked with so many wrestlers, and one of my favorite parts. It's great to go to the conventions. You know, I love it when the wrestlers see each other for the first time and they haven't seen each other in 20, 30 years sometimes. And they give each other a big hug, and it's like family reuniting. But one of my favorite things when I have talent up is just being in the car with the boys and going from A to B and just bullshitting with them about what this town was like, or the last time they were up here, or when they hit up this bar. Because that's what I'm in a car with my buddies from high school. We talk about stuff we did in all these different towns, and we didn't live half the life that, you know, these gypsies did on the road for 20, 30, 40 years. You know? So that's kind of the narrative that I was looking for. I wanted people to kind of, I didn't want it to be War and Peace, you know. I wanted it to be a fun read that people can like. So I helped Killer Tim Brooks, rest in peace. I helped him with, I'm in the process of still getting everything together. The first draft's done, but I helped him with his biography. And he told me after he read the Scott Casey book, he goes, I read it in 2 sittings. And I'm like, that's kind of the vibe I wanted. I didn't want, so when I read books, for whatever reason, I'll read 2 and 3 books at a time. So I'll read the first 100 pages of one, and I'll move over to 50 pages of another, and then go back to book A. That's just how my mind works. But with this book, I wanted someone to be able to pick it up and, you know, spend 2 or 3 hours with it to where they're caught up, because they get story after story. It's nothing that's going to overwhelm them with everything that's going on. Either, you know, I want to take people to, you know, kind of a different place, you know, and that place being, you know, the shotgun of a car, or the driver of a car. Well, Scott's got a case of beer and he's telling stories. And that's kind of, that's what I'm hoping to do with the book. And, you know, it's great to hear that you said we accomplished that, Angelo. Thank you.
Well, one of the great things about being in my position is I can read One Last Ride. And then if I have any questions, I can pick up the phone and call Scott. Mm-hmm. Or I could get his ass on my show and just run him through the mill.
Absolutely.
Dan and I are good like that. Dan and I are real good like that. Scott, so let me ask you a question. It's pretty clear from the conversations you and I have had in the past that you thought for a long time about putting something down on paper. When did you make that fervent commitment to say, you know what, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna bite the bullet. I'm gonna do it now. And I'm gonna leave. I'm not gonna leave anything out. I'm gonna put everything in, and and let people see my life, good, bad, and the good, bad, and the ugly.
It probably was after I met Nick, because he was so. I mean, I hate putting him over like this, but he's so intelligent, and he has a lot of verbiage that comes through, and it makes a lot of sense. And I thought, all these years I ought to do something with that, make a book out of it. And we got to talking, and that's how we got started with it. It's just you don't. I didn't want to waste it. I didn't want for people to not know that. We'd spend 6 hours, 7 hours driving somewhere to wrestle in front of 40, 50, or 100 people. People would go, "Are you out of your damn mind?" Yeah, I guess I was, because I love doing it. But
well, you know what, Scott? I'm gonna put you over for a little bit here. That driving, 200-300 miles to work for 50 or 100 people. People don't understand what that did for you as a worker. Because these kids today are spoiled, and I'm just gonna call a spade a spade. They're spoiled, okay? They don't know what it's like to work in front of a small crowd. They get contracts that are in the six figures to start with. They're spoiled little brats to begin with. They don't know what it's like to pay their dues or to earn their keep. But guys like you and Boogie and Manny Fernandez and Johnny Mantell and all my other old buddies, you guys, you worked for 50 people, and if it was snowing out, maybe 5 people came, and if you had a good night, maybe you had 300 or 400. But you guys worked every night, and that's where you learned your craft. And that, my friend, is why you got so good so quick.
Well, and it's like I used to tell people, young guys, when I was training them, I said, this is kind of a twofold thing, but I said, it's not what you do, it's how you do it.
Thank you.
I said, on the other hand, you could say it's not how you do it, but what you do. And both ways. I mean, and it's just, the old timers taught us timing, how to pause, how to stand, how to walk, how to look,
exactly,
when to throw a punch. And the old timers say, okay, you're going to sell this. Boom. And you would, and you get the match over. But you learn so much from these old guys, and they learned it from other old guys besides them. So
exactly.
It was
I heard a great quote one time. I forgot which one of the boys told me, but they say the way to learn this business, you learn it in 2 places, in the cars and in the bars. And it's
that's
true.
it.
That's
absolutely true, Nick. Honest to God, Nick, it's absolutely true. In the bars and in the cars.
Yep.
Well, if I may then, Scott, who was the elder statesman who taught you the ropes back when you started?
Well, I had a number of people. I had Terry Funk. I had Dory Funk Jr., Bobby Duncombe, Duke Myers. And the one person, he told me something that I will always remember. And this was Lou Thez. I walk out, and he's standing by the curtains, and the first match is on. And I said, Lou, what are you doing? He said, I'm watching the match. I said, you're 7 times world champion. What the hell do you need to watch these guys for? He said, Scott, you can always learn from somebody, and you can steal it for yourself, and nobody can say anything about it. And I thought, wow. I'll never forget that.
I'll tell you what. You can't put a price on that kind of advice. You really, really can't.
No.
And that's something that's missing. The guys, they don't learn, and they don't learn to be creative. They don't think outside the box. They're cookie cutter wrestlers anymore because nobody does what Lou Thez did. And watch everybody and take a little, like Bruno Sammartino, rest in peace. Bruno was one of those guys that did the same thing. Now, he didn't have to because he was already the champion. But here's a guy who stood at the curtain and watched everybody, before him and after him.
And it's just, and the way you do things, the way you take a bump, the way if somebody gives you a tackle, which way you turn, left or right, to get up and receive whatever else you're going to have happen to you. It's just
exactly, Scott. Exactly.
You have got to be. Nobody's perfect, but you've got to be as perfect as you can be, and you've got to know how to sell. I even had, and I'm blowing the horn here, one night I'm wrestling Brute Bernard, and you guys probably don't know him, but he was 6'2" to about 290.
I know who Brute Bernard was.
He got so much heat on me, and I sold it so well. He came and said, "Scott, are you okay?" And I thought, I did my job right.
There you go.
That's just what it is. And by God, when you're working with guys like that, if you don't sell, you know what's going to happen.
They're going to make you sell. Oh, we heard that. Dan, what's the one thing, Dan, because Nick is a newbie here. Scott already knows, but what's the one thing that I harp on almost every week?
The one thing you about the learning the people stories versus the match results?
Psychology.
Oh, sorry. You harp on a lot of things. You have to be a hair more specific.
What's that? Are you
I said you harp on a lot of things. Be a hair more specific.
Oh, I'm going to smash. See, this is Nick. This is what I deal with every fucking.
Oh, no.
Okay. This is what I have to do every week with this kid. I'm telling you, I'm going to take this whippersnapper and teach him a lesson out back at the woodshed. But that's psychology. It's missing. It's dead. It's a dying art. It's a dying art. It's a dead art. Right. Nobody understands psychology because they're not trained to. They're not told to. Scott, what would happen in the day if, God forbid, you were in the ring, let's say with Bruiser Brody, and you didn't kind of like, sell for Bruiser, or you didn't, or your psychology was off, or you made him look bad, something you don't want to do. What would happen? Just tell somebody today.
Well, let me tell you, I worked with Frank, Bruiser Brody, Frank Goodish, anyway, and he was leaving to go to Japan, and the Funks and me and a couple other guys were in the back, and they said, "Well, we want you to drop the belt to Ricky Romero or somebody else," and he said no. Now here's a guy 6'6", 280 pounds. He said no, and they looked at him. They said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I'm dropping it to him," and pointed it at me. I went, "Oh shit, I'm gonna be in trouble now." I'm not even opening my mouth. So I doubt this happened very, very few times. We wrestled in Corpus Christi. It was his last match before he went to Japan. And you know how he wanted me to beat him? A sunset flip. In other words, jump over the top of him, hook his waist, and roll him over. 1, 2, 3. I thought, Jesus Christ, are people going to believe this? But he made me look so good, and I worked so hard for it, they did believe it. So I was
Scott, I asked you that question, and I used Bruiser Brody as an example because I absolutely knew that story beforehand. Now, you don't know that I knew that story, because there's not a lot of people who do. Unless you were in the locker room at the time, you wouldn't know. But Nick's going to find out that I know everybody in this business, pretty much everybody. And
I'm glad we're buddies now, Angelo.
Say again?
Speak up,
Say
Nick.
again?
Hello?
Did you lose him?
No, I'm here. The poor reception came up for whatever reason, but we're back.
I'm sorry.
Because you're living up north.
No, I was just saying, Angelo, it's a good thing that we're buddies now. The fact that you got so many connections. That's I'm glad I'm on your right side.
Yeah. Oh, bro, please. Are you kidding me? You're ever going by? It's a given. It's a given. Absolutely.
There you go.
But
I hope. Did you see the? I don't know, Dan. We may have to send Nick a copy of the Mafia show that we just did. By the way, we're doing part 2 on September 17th next week. Part 2 of Married to the Mob. But I digress.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, wait. Scott, you're going to love this show. We were talking about all these Mafia characters.
They made a movie. Yeah, they made a movie.
Here's the thing, too. Scott, this is a really good place to go, actually. Here's a really good place to go. And maybe Dan can pick up on it because he's the smartest guy in the room. That's what he tells me every week. When in your tenure in the business, have you ever had bear witness to any of these shady, mafia type characters doing business? Because we know that
I got a story for you.
Yes,
I'm in
I
Kansas
knew you
City.
did. Go for it.
Yeah. I'm in Kansas City, and my wandering eye sees this gorgeous, drop-dead gorgeous Italian girl. And I walked up to her and started talking. We set up a chance to meet later on. She walks away back to the restroom. One of the Italian guys said, "Do you know who you're talking to?" And I said, "No," and I can't remember his name. But anyway, he said, "You are talking to the daughter of the Mafia Don here in Kansas City." He said, "I would advise you to leave now and don't come back to this bar." Brother, you could not get me out that door so fast. And man, I really wanted to get with her so I could drop her linen and make her start grinning. But no, I said no, not me. I'd be floating in the water or somewhere, But that was true. I mean, you're talking about it Italian stuff.
Dan, you want to pick up on the wrestling mafia connection?
Well, we touched on it previously. It's and Scott, I'm sure you can vouch for this. There was a lot of, especially in some of the territories, a lot of how do we say this? Businessmen who funded some territories as a way of filtering and cleaning money and other things. And it's actually funny. And Nick, I don't know if you ever hit any of this on your research, but several high-profile talents came up through territories that are started as laundering fronts. And you see, I mean, obviously not as much now, but just lost Nick.
Oh,
well, stuff like that I tried to stay away from. I knew about it, but I mean, look and smile and keep your mouth shut was my policy, because you never knew who you were talking to. You never knew what their reputation was, and I always just tried to be nice to people. Otherwise, you might get your ass whipped or you're shot or killed or whatever. And I didn't feel like that.
To transition a bit, we talked about keeping things clean. Promoters, I know we try and keep more of the human side. Last time you were on, we talked about some of your travels and your road work and all that. When you were down south, what's the difference between working with a promoter who's a businessman and, say, the Von Erichs or the Funks, promoters who are also the wrestlers and the talent?
Well, they try to, the guys that were wrestling promoters like Fritz, he knew all about what we were doing. He knew how we felt, and we all knew that the Von Erichs were going to be over, and that was it. But he still would throw you a bone every once in a while and make you feel like you were important. But as far as the businessmen, they relied on their bookers to help them figure out what was up and what was down, and I tried to keep my mouth shut as much as I could. I realized that it wasn't going to do me any good to get into a pissing contest with these guys.
Yeah.
But I remember with McMahon. We were in Odessa for my last match, and I walked in the dressing room, and I'm sure I told you this before. I said, in 1990, do I have a job with you or not? He said, no. Just like that. He said, I want you to go to Atlanta and work for a year down there and come back. And I looked at him and I said, you know, Vince, I can accept failure when given a chance to fail. I said, and I'm not crying the blues. I said, but you guys never gave me a fucking chance to do anything. I was just one of the girls in the show, and I realized there were a lot of good talent that was that way. I mean, I saw many guys that were main events all over the country that couldn't even get in a main event match there in New York. But that's what he wanted. It was his money. It was his football. So we were going to play with it in his backyard the way he wanted us to. Otherwise, get the fuck out of town. You know, you weren't going to, you know, that's just the way it was. But, I mean, you know, the promoters were different if they were businessmen instead of wrestlers first. And you understood
well, and that brings up a good point, too. At what point did you realize, Scott, that the writing was on the wall and it might be time to get out?
I guess after I talked to Vince, and I mean, I'm 255, 60 pounds, and I'm all steroided up, and he's talking to me. And when he said that, I wanted to jump over the table and beat the shit out of him, but I didn't. I mean, you know, come on. What's that going to do? Everybody's going to say, oh, Scott's an asshole for beating somebody up, or he might have beaten me up. I don't know, because he was in damn good shape himself.
Yeah.
And I just, you know, I've been to so many territories, and I won belts and was a world champion and all this other stuff. And then I had to put guys over that I felt couldn't carry my jock strap. But anyway, when I was there in New York, I mean, guys like, I can't remember the names of the guy, Barry
Horowitz?
No.
Because, I'm sorry. I thought you were still talking about your final matches. My apologies.
Yeah, I am. I'm just saying, I just, after a while, you know, I got tired of being, okay, you're going to go 10 minutes and drop the fall, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
You know, and I thought, you know, I'd set records in Texas. I made a lot of money there, and I did well at it. And they didn't, that meant nothing. Even in Amarillo, where I was over like, you know, chocolate pie. But anyway, I was there, and they made me someone beat me in the middle of the ring, and the people couldn't believe it. And I worked for a couple, 2, 3, 4 years up there in Amarillo, you know. So it just, after a while, you learn. Hey, look, you know, I'm 42. I'm 42 years old. I'm still in good shape, but this ain't gonna work. You know, I mean, I had my ride, and like Nick said, one last ride, and that's what it was. You know, and
so
I was glad to.
After you know after you walk and wrestling is in the rear view mirror, you know what does Scott Casey pick up and do? You know, having been a physical, you know, world-class athlete his entire career, what do you do? Where do you go?
Well, I mean, you back up and say for 20 some odd years, 6 days a week, I worked out with weights, always, because they said you'll never be big enough, you'll never be this or that, blah, blah, blah. And I showed them different. But anyway, the thing about it was, hold on for a second, I gather my thoughts here. It's fun being 73. You have these senior moments. But anyway,
Take your time, brother. We got it all night.
Okay, all right. Anyway,
we're in no hurry.
Okay.
We're in no hurry.
Anyway, I worked out, and after Vince gave me my walking papers, I sat home for a month and a half, never hit a weight, drank my ass off, and I was depressed. I really was. I thought it's one of those things like, oh, this is never going to end. I'm going to be able to do this till I'm my age now, you know. And I just, it was just, when you give your heart and soul and your body and your life and your divorces and everything into the business, it's just depressing. It was, but I went down to Houston, and Ivan Putski was there, and he said, will you help me train some people? I said, sure. In walks Booker T and his brother Stevie Ray. Now, these guys are big boys, 6'3", 6'4", and I trained them, and I left, and I went back up to Dallas, and next thing I know, I told these guys, I said, look, they're going to call you every name in the book. They're going to call you the N-word. They're going to say behind your back, not to your face. I said, but like I said, it's not what you make, it's what you save. And I hadn't seen them for, 10 years. And next thing I know, they're asking me to come to Las Vegas and present them into the Cauliflower Alley Club.
Cauliflower, yeah.
And, and I was so proud that they were there and they did it. And it's a lot of fun,
Absolutely. Scott, do you do you keep in touch with some of the few that are still around? Do you keep in touch with some of your cohorts from Southwest? I know Manny is still around.
I keep in touch with Terry Funk,
right?
Because he's not real well. He's got stomach problems, and I talked to him today, and he said he had to have a shot in his hip because it was killing him. I talked to Hillbilly Jim all the time. If you ever had him on your show, you can't get a word in edgewise.
I'd love to have him on the show if I knew where to reach him.
Well, I will talk to him, and I will give him your number and see if he wants to do it. He has a radio show down in Tennessee, somewhere like that. I'll find out, but I'll get back in touch with you. But you'd love it. This guy is amazing with his verbiage. And I also talked to Ivan Putski. And let's see, who else have I talked to lately? Bruce Swayze, beautiful Bruce. Yeah, a great guy. I don't know whether you ever met Bruce or knew him or whatever.
I know who he is, absolutely, of course.
Yeah, he's quite a guy. And who else did I talk to the other day? I'm trying to remember. I'll talk to. Oh God. It's so much fun. Don't get old. It's the living fucking shit. So I'm telling you. You sit there. I'm sorry, folks, but just the way I feel.
Only a wrestler could say getting old is the drizzling shits.
It is. It is. Come on. I'll go in somewhere or I'll go out the door and I got to go somewhere and I'm looking for my keys. Well, fuck, I've got them in my hand.
There you go. Well, I'll tell you what. Let me throw it to Nick for a few minutes here. Nick, getting stories out of Scott Casey, was it a natural thing, or did you have to get him liquored up first?
No, they're extremely natural. So I did the research on my end, and I had some help from my buddy Jim that helped with a timeline, and that timeline literally had thousands of matches on Scott, people he teamed with, people he faced, towns he was in. And I kind of used that to structure a lot of my questions. But it was extremely easy. Don't get me wrong. We've thrown a few back over the years. But at no point, I can't speak for myself. At no point, I don't think I even have a drink during the recording process. We were recording 3 to 4 days a week. Lots of times on my end, it was after I was done with my full-time job at the time, which was I was working for a national food distributor called the Chef's Warehouse. So I'd be done keying my orders, and I would talk to Scott from anywhere from 60 minutes to maybe even 2 hours. And I would transcribe everything on the weekends and then, go through the follow-up questions the week after. And this process went on for, about 6 months of just gathering all the information. And at no point did I feel like Scott was a lemon that had been completely squeezed dry. Like, I feel like we got a ton of information out. As a matter of fact, I didn't know that story he just told about Brute Bernard. there's a good Brute Bernard story in the book, but I didn't know that particular story that he just brought up minutes ago. So Scott's got a ton of stories. He does tell the same ones sometimes, but there's so many stories that we haven't heard, and I just try to do my best to get many
Nick,
of them.
let me tell you something, young Nick Masci.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you something, young fella.
Yes, sir.
They call Angelo the extractor. You know why?
Why?
Because I get shit out of people.
There you go.
Daniel, you want to pick up on where Daniel, don't give me that look.
I didn't say anything.
You didn't have to. You gave me that eat shit and die look.
Oh boy.
This is what I have to go through. Scott, he does this to me every week.
What he actually means is this is what I have to deal with every week.
Well, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to pick up where Nick left off, you schmuck. Jeez.
Well, Nick, you hit it on the head. You said how the stories just keep coming. I mean, Angelo mentioned at the top of the show, this is the 7th time Scott's been a friend of the show since the beginning. And I mean, how you can have 7 plus hours, 8, 9, 10 hours of conversation. And the occasional bit here and there, and every time you hear new material, that goes back to my earlier question. I talked about how you kind of fine tune the book. Is there any plan with the fact that there's so much more to tell to do a follow up, or is this?
Wow, that's a great question. I think there's no plan for that. I think that's something though that could be explored. Absolutely. As I was saying earlier, I finished Killer Tim Brooks, his what's going to be his memoir now. The book, I was hoping it'd be out the end of this year. Obviously, with Tim's health taking a turn for the worse, and then him unfortunately passing on. It's kind of that. I truth be told, I haven't gone back and worked on it since. It was a hard few weeks for me, that process of just getting to know someone, watching them, go through the process of, essentially getting sicker and sicker. And it was very hard. So, but I do want to release that book for his family at some point, because that is my biggest writing priority. Hopefully getting that book out maybe the first quarter of 2021. And but then down the line, I'd love to do something with Scott again. As soon as he can stay up in my state for more than 24 hours, I want to bring him back to Connecticut so we can do the loop, Connecticut, New York, all these places up this way again, because I know he's in Arkansas right now, as he calls it, Bigfoot country. So but I'd love to get him back up to civilization to where we can start.
Oh, absolutely. You let me know when you get him back up here, brother, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, you mentioned something, the passing of Killer Tim Brooks. Our condolences to the family of Tim Killer Brooks, and, of course, the Armstrong family. This has been a bad year for wrestling, guys. We lost a lot this year. We lost an awful lot of people this year. I think we're going to do, Dan, on a serious note, I think we're going to dedicate this show. Why don't we do this? Why don't we dedicate this show to all the people we lost this year? You know? And
amen.
Yeah, amen is right.
Well, Johnson too. Yeah.
What? Yeah. So if you I tell you what, if you get a chance to come up here, Scott, up back to the Northeast for any length of time, you better have me on speed dial.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm serious. Call my ass up. I'll be there, brother. I'll be there.
One of the funnest things that I did up there when I was with Nick was meeting his kids. They are I call it Dylan, Mr. Dylan, and Brookie. I mean, she's like Nick. They were just amazing, and I just loved them to death. So that's to you,
Scott,
Nick.
I don't think I've told you, but Scott, my daughter doesn't go a week without asking about you. She wants to know when Scott Casey's coming to visit again. True story. Yeah. So
I'm ready.
Hey, we're gonna have round 2, 3, and 4 after everything gets back to normal, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, slowly but surely, finally in New Jersey, I can report that things are starting to open up for the first time since February.
That's good.
and not a moment too
great.
soon.
Yeah.
Not a moment
Absolutely.
too soon. Well, I'll tell you what, Nick, you are a welcome guest back here again. I'm sure we're going to have you back.
I would love to be back.
If you think that this is the last appearance by Cowboy Scott Casey, you got another thing coming there.
Don't tempt me with a good time.
Because
there you go.
I know Scott, and I tell people, I know Scott Casey, and every once in a while he remembers me.
Yeah. Just make sure I tattoo it on my arm or something like that.
Scott, thank you once again, my friend. I'll give you a holler tomorrow. Nick, thank you for joining us. I want everybody just to stay where you are for a minute. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping, Dan and I. Daniel, next week, tell everybody what's coming up. We've got the return of Stephen Plim.
Yes,
on
sir.
the 22nd. Tell everybody who Stephen Plim is, brother.
Stephen Plim was a manager and producer. He was the manager and best friend of Tiny Tim, the famous ukulele player, unique talent in music. And he wrote a book called Tiny Tim and Mr. Plim, where he told the story, a lot of behind the scenes stuff, very, how to put this politely, very
risque,
adult personal stories, that shed a light on Tiny Tim a lot of people hadn't seen before, and we had him on. He told a lot of good stories. We actually had Vince Russo as a cameo. He did a cameo of sorts on the show, and he was here for an hour and 10 minutes. What do you mean a short? Well, I didn't say short. I said a cameo, or maybe I didn't say short. But he, compared to the 5-6 hours he promised you.
Second appearance. He was with us for 2.5 hours the first show.
Right. But he on the air, we got the recording. He promised you 5 hours if you could get.
And he welched on that, the bastard.
But in just like we talked about with having Cowboy on, we barely scratched the surface. So we've got a lot of returning guests coming up.
Oh, absolutely. You know we're going to do another show on the book for sure. That's a given. That's a given. Because I like having Scott on, so I invite him on all the time.
Well, I mean, look at
next week, September 15th, a true icon in wrestling, the legendary friend of the living legend Bruno Sammartino, his lifelong friend, in fact, from the Pittsburgh area. Old school WWF back in the day, Daniel, when you were just a wee pup. You know what? When we get off the air, you and I are going to have those. We're going to talk. But Dominic DeNucci will be here from the original Worldwide Wrestling Federation. He is a guy, he's 89 years old. He's sharp as a tack. He's amazing. This guy is just on top of it. It's amazing that guy, 89 years old, can remember every match he's ever had. But still doesn't know how to work the clock on his VCR. What's that, Scott?
I said, tell him I said hello.
Well, I got a better idea. Why don't you come on and talk to him?
Sounds like a winner.
I'll call you next week, brother. I'll have you back. See, it's anytime I get a chance to have Scott Casey, I'm going to have him on. I'll bring him.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
And we also, Daniel, we've got next week, we also have, who do we have? Oh, I just said it too. We've got, George Anastasia, the famed mob author and writer.
Part 2 of our Mafia series.
Yes. Part 2 with George Anastasia, Married to the Mob. Wrestling with the Future of Organized Crime. That's going to be a good one. And, of course, like I said, September 22nd, Stephen Plim. And I'm hoping a surprise guest for the 24th of September. I think it's about 99% right now, but I'm waiting for confirmation for the 24th. So I'm not going to say anything just yet. I'll probably have something for you either Thursday or next week. Anyway, for Cowboy Scott Casey, for Marvelous Nick Masci, For Dan the Man Sebastiano, the smartest guy in the room, I'm Angelo DeCipio for Wrestling with the Future. Take care. Happy wrestling, everybody. We'll see you next time.